and it's a pleasure to welcome you this morning to our webinar titled The Case for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We're joined this morning by DuPage Foundation trustees, committee members, staff, and grantees. Before I introduce our moderator, I'd like to let you know that we are recording today's session. Feel free to use the Q&A feature on your Zoom screen to ask any questions you might have. You can identify yourself or do so anonymously. Now it's my pleasure to introduce Grant Committee member Dianne Engram, retired manager of Equal Opportunity and Diversity at Fermilab. She'll introduce our topic and presenter. Dianne.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, The Case for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. That's been my passion for the past 35 to 40 years, and I made a career out of it at the National Lab in Illinois, Fermi. Our speaker today is Wes Becton, Executive Leadership Coach and Organizational Performance Consultant. He is CEO and founder of the George Washington Street Partners and is on the board of trustees for our own DuPage Foundation. We thank Wes for his service to our country, serving as a former officer and graduate of Ranger School. His service includes the Korean conflict and commander of the Army's Honor Guard Company in Washington, D.C. He earned his undergraduate degree at George Washington University and his MBA from Lewis University. Wes has been a leader for organizations in banking, education, and healthcare. He is the former board chair of Northeastern Illinois University and also serves on the board of Elmhurst College and Pan American Bank. It is my pleasure to give a warm welcome to Wes Becton.
Dianne, thank you so very much. Let me get my screen shared here. And it's, first of all, it's an honor to be a part of the DuPage Foundation. It's an honor to have an opportunity to talk to you all about a topic that I am very passionate about. Today, we're going to talk about the Chicago Bears. Just kidding. We're going to talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. And Simon Sinek is one of my favorite authors, and he always says start with the why. Well, here's a couple of things. Diversity, equity, and inclusion takes courage, takes hard work and focus, and it's good for business. But I want you to watch what happens here because I'm tricking you a little bit, because leadership actually takes a lot of courage. It takes hard work and focus, and leadership is good for business. I firmly believe that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a leadership issue. And if this effort doesn't start at the top, it will never work throughout the organization. Diversity, equity, and inclusion is a leadership issue. You know what? There's a lot of reasons why we can say it's important, and hopefully by the end of this, we'll have some questions that come in about why you all on the call think it's important. But at the bottom, sometimes this is where we end up. Some people just are afraid to talk about it because they're afraid they're going to say something stupid. And that fear of not saying anything can oftentimes create a void. It can create a vacuum. And as a leader, and by the way, we're all leaders on this call, when you create that void or vacuum in an organization, people fill that void or vacuum with their own version of why you're not saying anything or why you're not asking people a question. Come back to that a little bit more later. This is one of my favorite quotes by Tolstoy. And to sum it up, basically what he's saying is that somebody is not very smart, but you explain a really difficult topic to them, over time they can probably figure it out. But if you take somebody who's really, really, really smart and try to give them something simple to understand, if they've already made up their mind about it, there's no chance they're going to understand it. So what I'm going to ask you to do today is to not agree with anything that I'm saying. Don't disagree. with anything that I'm saying. Just kind of take it in, but notice what's happening to you. Notice what's happening to your emotions. Notice what's happening to you if something gets you in the pit of the stomach or makes you feel uncomfortable, because we all come at this topic from a very different perspective. Each of us is unique. We each have a set of lenses and filters that we see the rest of the world through. Literally, everybody can look at the same thing and you're going to see different things based on what all of your life experiences up to this point in time have told you. So I'm going to show you a couple of pictures. My kids would say that this is an old guy in a hoodie, but I just want you to take note of what sort of reaction you have to this picture. When Mr. Floyd was murdered this summer, a lot of my neighbors were surprised when I told them that in my neighborhood in Elmhurst in DuPage County, where I've lived for over 25 years, they were surprised to hear that I don't go for a walk in my own neighborhood without my dog. And my dog's a cute little cuddly thing. It's not a scary dog. But I told them, you know, if you see somebody that looks like this in your neighborhood and you don't know them, you don't know me, what's your first reaction? Does it trigger something in your amygdala? Our amygdala is an amazing thing where we can generate this fight or flight response. And let's face it, anytime we see something that's different, we process it. And so my neighbors were surprised to hear that. And I said, you know, think about what happens when you see this person walking through your neighborhood. And what are you going to do? Are you going to walk by and say hi? Are you going to walk by and hope that the person doesn't notice you? Are you going to walk on the other side of the street? Are you going to call the police? Or, as happened in Georgia last year, maybe you'll chase me out of the neighborhood and shoot me. Again, these things have actually happened in our lifetimes. Once you look at the next pictures, same person. My kids would say that's still an old guy on the right side of your screen. But notice what sort of reactions you have when you see the picture of me in a uniform. What sort of reactions do you have to that? Is it a feeling of patriotism? Based on your level of consciousness, it's going to inform you about something. Because I tell you what, in some parts of the world, if you show this picture, it's going to be offensive because maybe we've attacked your country. Maybe we've occupied your country. Or if you've served in the military, you can look at this uniform and tell very quickly that, hey, this person was a captain in the Army. This person was an infantry officer. This person jumped out of airplanes, rappelled out of helicopters, and at one point went to Ranger School. You could tell all that just from looking at the picture. But again, it's all based on our level of consciousness. Today, we're going to talk about a few definitions. You're going to get a little bit of history. You're going to get some practical examples. And at the end of this, you've got an opportunity to decide what you want to do with this information. So diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you say it real fast, sounds like one thing, but it's actually three things. So think diversity, it's all about differences. I've got a picture of a 64 box of 64 Crayola cans, crayons, lots of different colors there. But think about a meeting you're at when everybody looks exactly like you. That's not diversity. Or think about a meeting where everybody went to the same schools. Everybody's got the same friends. Everybody's got the same beliefs. Everybody's got the same lenses. Diversity is about all of the differences that we have that can add value to our lives and to our organizations. Equity is a little bit different. That's more about a level playing field. Is equal opportunity really available for everybody? It's about justice, the scales of justice. And if you notice in the picture, the scales of justice are blind, color blind, meaning that it doesn't matter what color a person is or what gender a person is or what sexual orientation a person has. Everyone has the right to the same opportunities, to justice. In inclusion, which we're going to talk about a little bit more later, it's all about making people feel included as opposed to doing things that can cause people to feel excluded. Next kind of definition I want to make sure we're all on the same sheet of music about, it's this idea of implicit bias. I've got a link on the bottom of the slide to some free implicit bias assessments you can take from Harvard. There's about 30 some of them, but I don't want to ruin it for you. But at the end of the day, they all pretty much say the same thing. We generally prefer to be around people that are like us. And that amygdala hijack, that fight or flight or freeze response that I talked about earlier, that's also triggered when we're around people that are not like us. But what does like us really mean? Is it about personality or behavior? Or, hey, I'm a Cubs fan, you're a Sox fan, we can't possibly like each other, but then how is it we can all come together as Blackhawks fans or Bears fans? It's about people that are like us, beer or wine. And oh my gosh, what an election cycle we just had. Can a Democrat and a Republican actually have a conversation together without it coming to blows or leading to violence? And then what about this issue of race? Why is race such a big issue? Well, in order to understand that, you really have to go back in time to 1619, when the first slaves, Africans, were moved to America as slaves. 1619. We were an agrarian society. We needed a labor force. At the time, turned out to be wrong, it was thought that a slave labor force would be a cheap form of labor. Well, slavery ends. You're a landowner in the South. You're thinking, I've got crops in the field. I need to get them out. I need to plant crops. What are you going to do? Well, here's the idea. I'm going to build you former slaves, since slavery's been outlawed. I'm going to build you a town. I'm going to rent you a place to live, and I'm going to pay you a salary. Now, the amount I'm going to pay you is going to be less than the rent that I'm going to charge you, but hey, it's a pretty good deal. Go live in these towns. And oh, by the way, if you try to leave these towns, we're going to terrorize you, and we're going to make sure that it's not a pleasant place for you to want to be. So some things in history, Compromise of 1877, which ended the Reconstruction period, which meant that in the South, these former slaves had now been freed, lost the protection of the federal government, and it was basically done to allow Rutherford B. Hayes to win a contested election. You want to read about contested elections, highly recommend you read that. Fantastic history. Then you've got Plessy versus Ferguson, which basically said that separate but equal is allowable in the United States. Well, what else is happening at our time? We're moving from an agrarian society to an industrial society. You saw a great migration, large numbers of Blacks in America moving from the South to great cities in the North, like Cleveland, Detroit, Pittsburgh, Chicago, and some very affluent Black communities were developed. I'm going to come back to the FLEXNER report a little bit later, but at that time, segregation wasn't necessarily legalized until around 1914. President Woodrow Wilson signed an executive order which basically legalized segregation in the federal workforce, which turned into Jim Crow laws and Black codes. And Black codes were these things that, hey, you know what, if you're arrested, we're going to lease you back to people and you're going to work for them as part of your sentence. Do your own research on this. It's amazing what our history informs us about how we got to where we are. Then obviously in 1964, you've got the Civil Rights Act, which created a lot of the laws that we're living under today. And I've given you some resources on the bottom, but again, this is my plea. If you're fascinated by this, or if you don't agree with something, do your own research, look it up yourself and come up to your own conclusions about how we got here. So this is a picture of my hero. This is my dad. My dad is going to be 95 years old this year, lives just outside of Washington, DC. My dad enlisted in a segregated army. That meant if you were a Black person, you served in one unit. If you're a white person, you served in another unit. In World War II, fought in the Philippines. Also went on to fight in the Korean War, which was mentioned in the beginning. I served in Korea in the 1980s. The war still hasn't ended. There's a armed system in place. There's still a demilitarized zone still active, but whole nother topic. But my dad fought in the Korean War, fought in the Vietnam War. Ended up this guy who enlisted in a segregated army in World War II, retired in 1983 as a lieutenant general, 3-star general in the Army, went on to become the director of FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, in the Reagan administration, was the president of Prairie View A&M University, historically Black college in Texas, and also was the CEO of the Washington, D.C. public school system. So that's the reason why I don't live in Washington, D.C., because those are some pretty big shoes to try to fill. So I'm going to apologize about some of the language and some of the slides that I'm going to show going forward. It's dated. In some cases, it's borderline offensive. But talking about this idea that diversity, equity, inclusion, leadership takes hard work, I want you to go back to 1944. The military still segregated. You had white officers that were leading Black soldiers. What they found is that many of these white officers had never interacted with people that didn't look like them. And the concern was that there were stereotypes. And when you and again, this is 1944, when you stereotype people, you put them in a box, and then people generally don't perform well when they're put in a box. Great leadership principle to learn there. But this is an excerpt from that manual, which at the time was very, very progressive. But what it talks about here is that all people is a dangerous way to look at it, by saying all Black people, all French people, all Chinese people, because as research has found, there's a distribution of a lot of things in every population of people. There's really, really, really smart people that are from whatever country. There's really smart people that are from this country. There's really stupid people that are from, again, I could go on and on, but the point is that distribution of intelligence, distribution of skills and attributes, it's found in every population. But when we stereotype people and say, well, everybody that looks like that or that is that gender is that way because that's what I was taught, that can become dangerous. But here's the point. In order for the military to become the meritocracy that it is, it took a lot of hard work and focus. They had to invest the resources into making this work. How else could a Black kid from Philadelphia who enlisted in the Army in World War II rise to become a three-star general? And it doesn't need to be said that the current Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, was a Black American, went to West Point, 4-star general, and now he's leading the largest department in the current administration. So this idea of inclusion or exclusion, a couple of book references I've given you. Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. Great book, sometimes hard to read because she does such a masterful job of weaving together the Indian caste system with the experience of Blacks in America, and she connects that with the Jewish population in Nazi Germany, and how it's all based on this fear that if we allow other people to be included, somehow that's going to take us down on the ladder of life. It's a zero-sum game, the way most people look at it, based on fear. So if those people come in, Well, that means, and they go up, that means I've got to come down. And that's just not true. And she does a masterful job of explaining it. The other book I've given you isn't a typical diversity, equity, and inclusion book. She's actually a design engineer, product design. And what she does is she uses the idea of product design to show how easy it is to exclude. So think about the computer mouse. Many of us have them, some of us don't. But a computer mouse designed for a right-handed person, which meant that if you were left-handed, you had to learn how to use it as a right-handed person. Why? Because left-handed people were not in the majority, they were the minority in designing this from a product standpoint. Just didn't make sense to design it for a left-handed person. But she personalizes it even more. And here's what she says. Think about a time as a kid when you were on the playground and you didn't get picked to be on the team. Most of us can remember that. Or think about the time that you didn't get invited to the party. Or think about the time your kid didn't get invited to the party. Well, you know what? That's what exclusion is. It's really easy to exclude people. It takes a whole lot of work and effort to include people. But again, when people are feeling excluded, they're not gonna be productive. When people are feeling excluded, they're not gonna be engaged. And you can go on and on and on. But again, sometimes all we have to do is just personalize it to realize how we felt when we were excluded, to understand how what we're doing may be excluding other people. Another one of my favorite authors, Brené Brown. Brené Brown has written several books, one of them Dare to Lead. And in it, she describes some research she did with 15,000 leaders across all industries. And when she did that research, she found there was only one identifiable trait in the top leaders of those 15,000 that she researched. That one trait was vulnerability. Okay. I guarantee you 25 years ago, that wouldn't have been on the top of anybody's leadership trait list. But here's what she does, and it's pretty powerful. When she's giving these talks, she says, I want you to think of someone who's done something courageous, but didn't show vulnerability. And just for the sake of time, I'll cut to the chase. You can't think of one because by definition, courageous means that you've put yourself out there, you've taken a chance, you've taken a risk, you've done something that you weren't sure how it was gonna turn out. And what she says is that is what vulnerability is. And the leaders that show that, those are the ones that people want to follow. A couple of quick stories. I was given a talk similar to this to a men's group in Elmhurst right after Mr. Floyd's murder, and we were outside, and one of the at the end of it, one of the people in attendance said, "Hey, Wes, you know what? I agree with everything you're saying, but here's the problem. You know, where I come from, back home, I've got family and I've got friends that don't agree with this. They don't agree with the importance of diversity, equity, and inclusion." And so I said, wow, you know, that's great self-awareness. Congratulations. But then I also said, you know, so tell me a little bit more. And he said, you know, I don't want to lose those friendships. I don't want to lose that family relationship. I don't want to lose that. And I said, well, again, great self-awareness, but it's a simple question. How important is this issue to you? If it's not that important, you're probably not going to do anything about it. But then I want you to go back to remember that video that many of us watched of Mr. Floyd being murdered. And if you remember, there were 3 other officers standing around as that happened. And they didn't intervene. They didn't say anything. They didn't do anything. They allowed it to happen. And so if you're not willing to speak up to family and friends that maybe have a difference of opinion and state your opinion, you're really no different than those other officers, because you know what, in order for this to change, it's going to take people that have courage, that are willing to stand up and say something when something crosses a line. When I'm in a conversation, you know what, probably isn't going to cross the line, but I tell you what, it has in terms of gender. I've got 4 older, don't judge me. I said this yesterday, don't judge me. I've got 4 older sisters and no brothers. I'm the youngest, and my sisters used to beat me up a little bit. So when I hear something that crosses a line in terms of, hey, all women are do this, or using language is not appropriate, guess what I do? I say something. A, I'm afraid of my sisters, but B, it's the right thing to do. But I wonder what happens, throw this out there as a question, maybe you can answer it in the Q&A. What do you do when you hear a conversation that crosses the line? How likely are you to speak up and say something? Remember, leadership requires courage. In order to be courageous, you've got to be willing to show some vulnerability. I want to just give you another example. One of my clients is a football coach out on the East Coast, Division III team, did not play football this year because of the pandemic, but he was having a hard time figuring out how to talk to his players, especially his players of color, about this issue of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Make a long story short, he ended up getting to the point where he said, hey, I want to put together a panel of my former players for my current players, and I want to have a real open conversation about race. And so he did that. He asked me to moderate it. I got to tell you, it was one of the most powerful conversations that I've been able to participate in. Here's what happened. One of his current players, player of color, and another current player of colors from just outside New York City. The non-player of color is from Texas. Nothing necessarily in common, different political views, but they developed this great friendship because they got to know each other. But here's what the player of color said. He said to his teammates, you know what we do as football players is violent. What we do is dangerous. We put ourselves on the line every day in practice. Every time we go out there for a game, we're risking our bodies to do what we do. So when you tell me you're afraid to ask me how I'm doing, I'm not buying it. I texted the coach during this webinar, and I said, hey, I know we got about another 20 minutes, but I think we can stop right here because nothing anybody's going to say is going to make this point any greater than that. So it takes courage, and think about where courage shows up in your life, and also think about why this might be an issue where you're uncomfortable showing courage. Again, all about self-awareness and those lenses that we look at life through. And so a lot of my clients were having a hard time trying to figure out how to talk to their employees about it. As I said at the beginning, if you're not saying anything, you're creating a void or a vacuum, and people are going to fill that vacuum with all sorts of reasons why you're not asking about it. But here's a simple question that I worked with all my clients to just get it out there. 4 words. How are you doing? And then shut up. Don't say anything. Just listen. If the other person's not ready to talk, that's not on you. That's on them. When they're ready to talk, they know that you're willing to listen. I've got a book reference here, Crucial Conversations, fantastic topic. The book's a little dry, the training's really good, but at the end of the day, what it teaches you is you've got to take judgment out of it. You've got to stop saying that, hey, I'm right and you're wrong, or you're this and I'm that. You've got to master your own story. You've got to figure out what you're telling yourself about why that person is saying that or thinking that. It's always helpful to start with the facts. There's less emotion attached to the facts. And when you have emotion, that's when things start to go sideways. So if you start with the facts, it has a better chance of succeeding. But guess what? If it gets a little out of bounds, stop. Just back out. Keep it safe until you're ready to have that conversation, or the other person's ready to have the conversation. Be curious. You can ask pretty much anything from a position of curiosity, but if you ask it from a position of judgment or superiority, the other person's not going to receive it all that well. And again, don't assume you know the answers. By definition, being curious, that's what scientists do. They're curious about things. Don't assume you know the answer. Ask the question from a position of curiosity. So again, why is this important? So my daughter and her husband and our 23-month-old granddaughter and our soon-to-be-born granddaughter live in Columbia, Missouri. They both went to the University of Missouri. A lot of my tuition dollars went to the University of Missouri. I like Mizzou, but Mizzou had this ad up that's on your screen for about 15 minutes. If you want Google marketing fails, if you Google Mizzou advertising, this is out there. And unfortunately, even though it's up for 15 minutes, it's not going away. If someone that had a lens on that was looking at this ad from a diversity, equity, and inclusion standpoint, they probably would not have put this ad up, or they would have moved some of the pictures around. But to say that, hey, if you're a white female, you're a future corporate financier. If you're a white female, you're a future doctor. What are you saying about the future of the two people of color that are in that picture? So why is this important? Well, this is kind of the dark side of it. It's important because without that lens, something like this might happen. And again, I think that there's a lot more that we could say about this, but I want to talk to you now about some historical stuff that has a current day tie. This is called the FLEXNER report, written in 1910. The American Medical Association commissioned a physician by the name Abraham Flexner to look at all of the medical schools in the country. And what they were trying to do at the time, medicine wasn't necessarily a standardized profession. Pretty much anybody could get into medical school, no real qualifications for admission. There was what was called quackery going on, or people were trying things without using evidence before they did it, without it being evidence-based medicine. The character of the physician profession, standardizing clinical schools. One of my good friends, he's on the board of trustees with me at Elmhurst University, he teaches medical ethics, and he and I had a fantastic conversation about this report. So on the surface of things, this seems like, wow, what a great idea, standardizing the profession. Here's what happened though, and again, I warned you that some of this language is a little hard to read, but what happened as a result of this, at the time, there were 7 Black medical schools. When this report came out, he recommended closing 5 of them, so there were only 2 left. One is Diane's alma mater, Howard. The other one's Meharry. Those were the only 2 medical schools that Black Americans wanted to become doctors could go to, because the other 5 were closed. But read some of this language here. There was this thought that was prevalent in medicine and in society that, you know what, Black people had germs and they would possibly infect white people. No necessarily evidence for this. Again, ironic because they were looking at evidence-based medicine, but this germ theory was taught in medical schools. Now, again, think about what happened from 1910 until around 1960. Those were the only 2 primary, there were some exceptions, medical schools that a Black American could go to. But in all those other schools, this germ theory was kind of thought of as doctrine. Well, there's a CDC report that came out in October, and you can go back and look at other CDC reports. And again, it's ironic because we're talking about evidence-based medicine, but this is a report that came out in October. It's age discriminated, it's race discriminated, it's gender discriminated. It was based on a retrospective analysis of hand washing prior to and after cooking, prior to, after using the restroom. And what they found is that the category of people that are least likely to wash their hands are white males between the ages of 18 to 24. So again, no evidence going back, and you can go back and look at previous studies. I do some healthcare consulting. For those of you that aren't in healthcare, you may be shocked to realize that when everybody does hand hygiene audits, it's never 100%, a little bit scary. Even post-COVID, it's not 100%. So this is kind of a big deal. Hand washing is a good idea. Let me introduce you to Stephen Huffman. Stephen Huffman is a state senator in Ohio. This is June of 2020, not 1920, but June of 2020. This was the quote from Mr. Huffman. Mr. Huffman was at a Senate hearing, state Senate hearing in Ohio, questioning some people from the health department. And he said this. I won't read it. You all can read it for yourselves. But that was his question. And I'm going to ask you up front, hey, do you think there might have been some judgment in this question? But here's the next thing that may get your attention. It's actually not Mr. Huffman, it's Dr. Huffman. Dr. Huffman was an emergency room doctor in Ohio. Dr. Huffman is about my age, 55, 56. Dr. Huffman probably went to medical school sometime in the 80s, which meant that his faculty was probably taught by people that were taught during this period of germ theory. So I'm just wondering, and again, I don't know. I don't know this for a fact, but I'm wondering if that could have influenced Dr. Huffman's thinking. So we talk about this idea of systemic racism. Does it exist? Is it a real thing? I'll ask you to answer that very same question. Does it exist? Because I'm also wondering, for Dr. Huffman's patients, did they get the same, and again, I don't know this for a fact, but I'm asking the question, did his view on germ theory, his view on race, impact the care that he provided to people that were people of color? And again, I don't know the answer to it, but it begs the question. And again, the data just doesn't support it. So it goes back to that lens that we choose to look at life through. I'm going to end with this slide because Abner was one of my very best friends. Abner was the mayor of Elmhurst in the 80s. I got to meet him when he was a volunteer at a surgery center where I was the administrator. And Abner would come in on Tuesdays and he would come into my office and we would talk for an hour about life. He would tell me about what it was like growing up as a young Jewish kid on the west side of Chicago, what it felt like to get chased home by bullies because the bullies thought that somebody that looked like him and worshiped the way he did should not be allowed to even pass through their neighborhoods. And we would talk about life, and I miss him. We lost him back in 2012. But Abner, as a trustee at Elmhurst University now, is responsible for me becoming a trustee there, responsible for me being in the Rotary Club, responsible for me being on a bank board, just became a great friend. But at Elmhurst University, he was asked to escort a speaker that was coming to the campus. Speaker's name was Elie Wiesel. Elie Wiesel is a Nobel Prize winner. Elie Wiesel was coming to Elmhurst College to talk about one of his books, Night. Abner is escorting him around campus. They sit down on a bench under a beautiful tree on a warm day, not like what we have today. And Elie Wiesel asked Abner, tell me what you did during World War II. Abner told him, I can't talk about it. It's too difficult. Elie Wiesel said, no, please, I'd like to know. Abner says, look, I don't talk about this, but I enlisted in the 1st Infantry Division. My unit fought our way across Europe and we liberated the Buchenwald death camp. Elie Wiesel stops him, puts his hand on his arm, says, Abner, when did this happen? Abner tells him the exact day of the week, date of the month, the time. Elie Wiesel stops him again, and he says, still get chills. I've probably told this story 100 times. Elie Wiesel says, Abner, you saved my life. I was supposed to be executed the next day. And oh my gosh, Elie Wiesel goes on to tell Abner, you know what? You've got to tell this story. You can't keep this to yourself, because if you do, the same thing can happen again. Prophetic words. So from that point on, Abner made it his mission to go around to churches, synagogues, mosques, elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, civic organizations, anybody who would listen to him, and he'd tell his stories. And I've heard him do this talk. I heard him do this talk a number of times, and especially middle school kids, because middle school kids can be a little bit bratty sometimes. But Abner would show these pictures and tell these stories where he just had people, they were mesmerized by what he's saying. But he always said two things. And the two things he said were, you know what? It's about the consequences of being indifferent. The consequences of seeing something wrong and not having the courage to say something about it. Second thing he talked about is man's ability to be inhumane to other people. And whether that's physical or the absolute, tragedies that we saw in Nazi Germany, or whether it's what we saw with Mr. Floyd, or maybe it's just the words that we use in person or online, or how we view people, but our ability to be cruel to each other. He says, those are things that we have to be on our guard against, because again, if we don't, the same thing can happen again. So I'm going to end the presentation here, stop sharing my screen. And again, it's just been a pleasure and a great honor to be able to have this conversation with you and share some information. I'd love to answer any questions that you might have. Muted.
There are some questions in the Q&A box that I'd like to begin with.
Sure.
The first one was, could you share the link on bias from Harvard?
Yeah, I'll send that to Dave after the talk, and he can email it out to everybody who signed up for the presentation.
Okay, wonderful. A Mr. Uolo has some really good ideas about how to handle those interactions in So You Want to Talk About Race. I'm not sure what the question is, but do you know the publication? So You Want to Talk About Race?
I'm familiar with it, yes.
Okay. Jennifer Fabian asks, are there resources you could recommend for effective strategies to engage in difficult conversations without shutting down dialogue?
Yeah, I think that's it's going to go back to that idea of crucial conversations and taking judgment out of it. I think I can say this because maybe she can't hear me, but my wife is in the house as well. My wife is a really gifted coach, but she's also really nosy. What I mean by that is she can ask questions that I would never even think of asking. And she gets away with it because there's no judgment in what she's saying. She's just asking because she's by nature curious. And again, if you're curious and there's no judgment, you can pretty much ask anything that you want to ask. And again, if it's not safe, back out and come back in another way. But it's that idea of judgment that gets in our way, and being curious is a great way around that. So hopefully that answered the question.
Okay, next up, What basic steps can a person living here in DuPage County take?
Yeah, I love that question. I absolutely love that question. And so here's the thing. So I'm a 55-year-old Black guy. If you get 10 55-year-old Black guys to do this presentation, you're going to get 10 different versions of this presentation. But the only way you'll know that is if you have a conversation with someone. And so whenever I'm giving a talk on a college campus, I tell students, find the person that is the scariest looking person you can find on campus and go up and ask them their story. Ask them how they got to be who they are. Ask them what their life experience were. And here's my prediction. You're going to find some common ground. And when you find that common ground, you've got the basis for a great relationship. So two of my best friends who both live in DuPage County, his name is Ruben. Ruben is from Guanajuato, Mexico, small town in Mexico. Came to our country illegally. He's a citizen now, but he lives in Oak Brook. He's done pretty well for himself. But you know what? I'm a richer person because I've gotten to understand the Latinx community. I've gotten to understand Mexico. I've been to his hometown. I understand him. I would not have that richness if I didn't have that friendship with him. Another good friend of mine, Kunal, he lives in Naperville. He is from Gujarat, India. Knew nothing about the Indian culture, but going back to that book, Caste by Isabel Wilkerson, I had the opportunity to have an hour and a half long conversation where he explained the caste system to me. And I never knew to even ask him what his caste was. So my point is, by engaging with people that are different than you, you're going to find some common ground. My buddy Abner is the perfect example. If you look at us, we have nothing in common. We had nothing in common. Different haircuts, different height, different color, different religion. But you know what? We had this common bond mostly built around love of country, love of the military, but then also some other things blossom from that to the point where those things that could have separated us don't exist anymore. But this is my commentary. Unfortunately, we tend to not engage people that are different than us. And our political system is set up that if you have different political views, you're meant to be enemies and you're supposed to hate the other person. Well, in DuPage County, that's exactly the opposite of what I think this question was getting at, because what you want to do is you want to find that common ground. Yeah, hopefully that answered the question.
The next question, are companies being ranked in diversity and inclusion like the ESG ratings?
Yeah, so that's a great question. I'd almost punt that one to you, Dianne, if I can. And so, yeah, here's my disclaimer. I am not a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. There's people out there that do this so much better than I do. I'm a leadership coach. And as I said at the very beginning, this is a leadership issue. If leaders get this, the needle will change. If leaders don't think it's that important, my granddaughter, who is going to be 2 next month, will unfortunately still be having the same conversation because leaders didn't do what they could have done to move the needle. So Dianne, did you have some thoughts on that?
There are rankings. You may find 50 of the best companies to work for in the Chicago area. It's a publication that comes out every year, and diversity and inclusion are some of the benchmarks that they use to rank the companies. So if you're interested, you could look for that.
Yeah, I think that's a great resource. But going back to this idea of why it's important. So there's a research study done by Forbes Insights, probably about 9 years old now. But what that research showed is that management teams that were diverse had a 33% gain in productivity in generating innovative ideas than non-diverse teams. So diverse teams create innovation, but here's the real tangible piece to that. Millennials, and I know there's a couple on the call, millennials are stubborn. Millennials are persistent. You can say whatever you want about them, but they're not going away. They've got an idea about something. They're not going to let it go. You have to love that about that generation. But here's the thing. Millennials are looking for companies, want to work for companies that walk the talk. You've got a statement on diversity, equity, inclusion. Show me what you're doing in the community. Show me what you're doing to promote this idea. I don't want to see it on a piece of paper. Show me what you're doing. Guess what? If you want to attract talent going forward, as the boomers start to retire, you're going to have a hard time attracting good talent if you aren't actually doing something in this base. And so millennials, I love them. I think they're fantastic. I appreciate their passion. You're going to need them in your workforce. So you better be doing something to show that you're not just putting it on a value statement and then doing something different.
We've got another interesting question. What is the best way for an entire organization to take ownership of equity and inclusion, and that the onus should not be solely on the responsibility of the people of color and those who may have different gender identities, sexual orientation within the organization?
Yeah, I'm gonna kind of take a little bit of time to answer that because it's such a multifaceted question. So let's say you got a company that was founded around 1950, and the company's been doing business, doing well. But you know what? If they're still recruiting talent, people the same way they were in 1950, there may actually be some systemic bias, some systemic racism involved in how they're finding that candidate pool. Because something that I get asked a lot, something that the president of a very large bank, CEO of a very large bank, got in trouble for saying, you know, hey, I just can't find talented people of color. Well, if you're recruiting the same way you've been doing, yeah, you're probably going to get the same type of candidates that you've been getting. That's why I say this stuff takes some hard work and it takes some focus. But you know, Dianne went to a fantastic HBCU. When was the last time your company sent a recruiter to that school, or other HBCUs? You're recruiting Latinx employees. You know, what are you doing to identify those Hispanic serving institutions that have that designation to recruit on those campuses? You've got to take a deep dive into your practices that got you there. But as a specific answer to the question, yeah, if the leadership of the organization does not think it's important, it just won't be important. And that's why, again, at the end of the day, this can be an emotional issue. This can be a feel-good thing. Well, it's the right thing to do. But I tell you, that never lasts, because as soon as you have a miss in a quarter or miss on a P&L, that initiative is going to go by the wayside. You know, even when the military was desegregated in 1951 by an executive order by President Truman, it wasn't because of social reasons. It wasn't. The reason why it was done was during the Korean War, and we were getting our butts kicked. We were sending in replacements so fast to replace the people that were getting evacuated out that we couldn't take the time, and leaders and units on the ground were saying, we can't take the time to send Black people here and white people there. We've got to integrate. So that's what happened. And as it turned out, you know what? They fought pretty well together. Because here's the other commentary from my experience in the military. If you're cold, tired, hungry, scared, and just miserable or even homesick, and somebody offers you comfort, security, offers to help you, you don't care what they look like. Doesn't matter. You don't care where they're from. You don't care how much money they have in the bank account. You just are grateful for the help. And so if you think back to school, remember Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right down at the base level, it doesn't exist because you're helping each other out. So I don't know if that answered the question, but there you go.
There is one comment. The book, What If I Say the Wrong Thing by Verna Myers has been suggested as a book that will help start the conversation. So if we could follow up with a reference to that book in the after webinar stuff, that would be great.
Yeah.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that reading is a great way to get informed. And there's some great books out there. There's also some books that I would, here's my bias, my judgment, that aren't necessarily great. Maybe a couple of good nuggets you can get out, but there's some things that I may personally not agree with. And guess what? That's okay. That's why we read. The former president of Elmhurst College at the time, Bryant Curitin, used to have this, he used to say this all the time, said, we do lectures on campus all the time, and we have some people that are on the left, people that are on the right, people think this, people think that. The problem is that the only people that go to those lectures are the ones that agree with what that speaker says. What we need are people that don't agree with the speaker to go hear that speaker so that maybe they can try to find that common ground. And I think anytime you can read a book, you're going to get something out of it. And, what if I say the wrong thing? As a coach, what I work with my clients on is, if you're feeling fearful about something, it's a thought, feeling, action model. There's something that you're telling yourself that's making you feel fearful. And when you feel fearful, what do you normally do? And so if you can tell yourself something different that'll drive you to a different emotion, you'll get a different action. And so again, as your level of awareness increases and you're in that position where, should I speak up or should I not speak up? I'm wondering what to say. Yeah, I think a resource like that could be helpful. But again, sometimes just saying, how are you doing, for held at 5 fingers, but 4 words. How are you doing?
We have one question that addresses a concern about Black youth. And the young lady is asking, do you have resources that Black youth can use to respond and educate their peers in a productive and effective way through your Washington Street partners or any other source?
Yeah, there's a couple I could recommend, and again, I think I'll send the link to a couple of those resources to Dave after the presentation. So kids are funny, and used to be I could tell stories about when I was a kid and they'd be relevant. Now they're probably not anymore. But sometimes with kids, it's just a matter of trying to fit in and trying to find their place. And so sometimes having that vision for what can be accomplished is just incredibly important. So my story is, I grew up as the son of an Army general in the 70s. There weren't many Black generals in the 70s. And so in the military, even today, and stay with me here, that housing is segregated in the military. Not segregated by race, but segregated by rank. So if you're a listed guy, you live in one area, senior enlisted guy, you live in another area. If you're a junior officer, you live in one area. If you're a senior officer, you live in another area. But if you're a general officer, you live in this special place all by yourself. And as a kid, you're kind of limited to who you can, at the time, who you could get to on a bicycle or a skateboard. So most of my friends growing up were white, and I didn't really understand this whole race issue until I got a little bit older. I mean, my dad was the general, so a lot of people were afraid of the general, and they treated me very well. But here's for Black youth, here's some of the things that I think can be limiting. I'll never forget a conversation I had with this kid. This is in high school, Hampton, Virginia. A friend of mine who lived on post, we were going to school off post. said, yeah, this guy's dad's a general. And this young black kid said, there's no such thing as a black general. And I'm like, no, really, my dad's a general. But after a while, this person never had a vision that a black person could accomplish that. And, when my dad was the CEO of the Washington, D.C. school system, he'd mentor kids during that time. And there was a young kid who he was, kind of a weird thing, but the CEO of the school system was picking one kid, a quarter to hang out with on the weekends or take him someplace. And this one kid stopped coming one day. And when my dad's team tried to figure out why, what he was told is that the mom did not want him exposed to something that he couldn't achieve. I want you to think for a minute how sad that is, and how much parents can limit the vision that kids have for their future. And so when you're talking about resources for young black youth, and I'll be very specific, for young black males, it's creating that vision and a pathway for them that says there are opportunities for you to do this. Another client, CPA firm, I had him go talk to the managing partner, had him go talk to a high school where I was on the board, and had him talk to him about accounting as a career field, because there's a lack of black accountants. And when he was talking to this school, it opened up the kid's eyes. Wait a minute, you mean I could be a certified public accountant? Again, not even something that they were aware of. So those are some ideas. And when we work with clients, and whether they're private or corporate, we help them see things just a little bit differently. And and there's some other great resources that I can share at another time as well.
We have one additional question. It says, it seems as though race relations have gone in the wrong direction. Do you think that's why our country elected someone like Donald Trump?
Well, Dave got on. Did you save me from having to answer that question? Are we out of time?
I'm afraid not.
Okay. Well, so I'm gonna repack the question and take it out of binary terms. There's a book out there called Anti-Racist. It's got some great points in there, but I don't agree that it's a binary choice. Either you're a racist or an anti-racist. I think that anybody in any given moment can judge someone as being less than they are. And whether that's by race, gender, ethnicity, or just an observation we're making, I think that's dangerous. I think we've stopped talking about this issue. I think we've stopped talking about the issue of race, and I think we've become uncomfortable with it, which has allowed for this void to be created. And when you've got that void and that absence of truth, people come up with their own versions of their stories. And as our housing situation becomes less integrated and our school situations become less integrated, we run the risk of people growing up not interacting with people that don't look like them. And if that's happening in your school, you ought to be jumping up and down, yelling and screaming. I'll pick on, I don't have any kids in the school system and I pay taxes, so I should be angry, right? But no, I'll pick on District 205. The guy who's the superintendent, he's leaving, Dave Moyer, great guy, love him to pieces. He's doing a lot of great things in this DEI space, but in District 205, they have one black teacher, one black teacher. And what I tried to convince them of is that, you know what, you've got students that are growing up not seeing a person of color in a leadership position. You're doing them a disservice, because when they get to college, when they get into careers, they're going to be working with people that are different than them. And I think, people complain about higher education and the cost and is it really worth it? Well, what educational opportunities do is it helps create critical thinking. It helps create problem solving, especially in a liberal arts environment. but it also creates a co-curricular environment where people are forced to be in situations with people who don't look like them and see how other people think. And again, what you find is that common ground. So the political situation, Donald Trump, I'm not going to touch that with a 10-foot pole. There's a lot of books written about what has happened in our country. But I personally, I'll be honest with you, I'm very hopeful. I am very hopeful that the millennials, if there's any more on this call other than Kate, I'm sure there are, but the millennials that are out there are going to help drive this change through. My generation is sort of a transformational generation, but I think those millennials, because of that persistence, because they care about what's right, because they are passionate, I think all of that is going to drive our country to a place that's going to be uncomfortable for a while. But you know what? If we're willing to have conversations with people, I am convinced that our best days as a country are still ahead of us.
I appreciate that. And for those of you who need to sign off, please feel free, but our panelists have agreed to stay on for a while if we would like to. And Dianne, I have a follow-up question to that. How did you feel before last year, during last year, and are you hopeful now?
For me,
Yes.
before last year, I was concerned. I've been concerned for a couple of years because I know that diversity in the way we want the needle to move is fragile. And it requires that people show their vulnerabilities, but be honest with it. Just to let you know, I was very concerned after Charlottesville. I had a suspicion that we had not gotten to the root of what's going on in this country after the presidential term of Barack Obama. There was a lot of angst and anti-Black people that surfaced during his term in office, and from people who felt that it was their birthright to always live in a country that was controlled by whites. And when he got to be president, there was a backlash. So I became concerned. And now with the open murder of people that's being captured on cell phones, captured on television screens, it seemed as though we were winding the clock backwards. And that made me fearful. And like Wes said, I was concerned in doing some political work in the fall. I had to go in neighborhoods that were not mine to pass out materials. And I said, boy, do I really want to do this in this climate? I've had the opportunity to broaden my reach with people who don't look like me in serving on various committees and boards. And I know that they don't always see me as a Black woman. They see me as a woman and kind of non-racial, but I do have feelings that come from having been born and raised in this country. When we moved to Naperville 40 years ago, Naperville was a sundown town, which meant you couldn't spend the night here. And we had just signed a lease and given first and last month's rent. So we looked at the realtor and said, well, now what do we do? And she said, well, you don't worry about it because the company that moved you here is going to take up your cause if you have any problems. You won't have to get your own lawyer. But imagine how that felt. We put our stake in coming to Naperville, and we're then told after we wrote the check, well, you can't spend the night here. Naperville has changed, but that was because corporations made it change. They brought people from all over the world to work here. And it had to be safe for people to be here, to live here, and to put their children in schools. And I think that was the biggest driver, actually, for the county, because Naperville grew so rapidly and we were buying things all over the place. Wheaton, when I moved here, was dry. You couldn't even get a glass of wine in Wheaton. That changed. If you want to have a customer base, you've got to make some changes. So I'm not as hopeful as I was. I think this tribal politics that we have seen evidenced is heartbreaking for me. I'm a native Washingtonian, so to see the Capitol scaled like that and actually desecrated was something I never thought I would see. And to see the Confederate flag carried in the Capitol was more than I could imagine. I'm still not over it, but I'm working on myself, and I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, it sounds like you want to be hopeful, but you're going to need some evidence that we're heading in the right direction.
I hope with some frank talk and some honest and open conversations, we'll get to the point where I'm not scary and you don't have to worry about me devaluing the value of your home because I live in your neighborhood. We've lived in Naperville 47 years. And when we built this house, there were only 3 houses on the street. And so some of my neighbors have come much more recently. And I want to tell them, don't be scared. I've been here much longer than you have. And I want my home value to be just as good and strong as you want for yours. Okay, my kid went to the school. He didn't devalue that school because he was there.
Excellent. Okay, any other ideas or concepts we didn't cover today, Dianne or Wes? Any other questions in the queue? Doesn't look like.
I think we answered most of the questions. Let's see. There was one that said, it was actually a comment. Language is so important. Illegal is a weaponized term. And I, having been in a compliance environment, some things are clearly illegal. And when they are illegal, we need to tell people, we need to be honest about it. It is illegal to discriminate. It is illegal to harass. And I can't back down from that. It may be weaponized, but it's true, and the law backs us up. Wes, have you got anything on that?
Yeah, I think the question, a couple different ways that it could be looked at. I've heard the same question asked about calling someone an illegal, and that being a weaponized term. And I would agree with that. No one is illegal. They're a human being. They may be in the United States illegally, but that doesn't mean that they're illegal. They're still a human. And anytime we do something, say something that dehumanizes somebody, there's judgment associated with that. And again, that allows us to feel like we're superior than them. And sometimes it's being done because people are, again, it's that fear. Well, if those people come in, then that means they're gonna climb up and I'm gonna come down. So I sort of understood this, and this may create some consternation, but this idea of white privilege, and I sort of get it. So if you're a white male, and the only thing in your life that you have going for you is the fact that sorry, Dave, I'm looking right at you.
All good.
If that's the only thing you've got going on in your life is the fact that you're a white male, and now somebody tells you, well, hey, you know what, being a male isn't a big thing anymore. We're going to let women have equal status as you. Well, that might be a little bit threatening. But then you could say, well, at least I'm white. Well, then all of a sudden somebody tells you, well, you know, that's not a thing either, you know, so people of color now have the same right and access and they can do everything that you can do. That could become threatening if the only thing that you're telling yourself you've got going for yourself is the fact that you're a white male. And again, there's some judgment in what I'm going to say next, but if that's the only thing you've got going for you, nothing else in your life, everything else in your life is miserable, that's the only thing you got going for you, you're probably a pretty miserable person. And so at the end of the day, I think that if we can take judgment out of the way we view the rest of the world, a lot of weight goes off our shoulders. I mean, it really does. But you know, I love talking to people that are different than me. I love having conversations with them because, you know, I think every time I do that, my needle moves and so does theirs. So that's
There
my
was one last question.
Sure.
Someone asked, is the inequality of wealth the root of the problems with equity, inclusion, and diversity? And I'd like to take this one stab at that. I don't think it's the inequality of wealth. I think it's the inequality of access and opportunity. Because if you don't have access to the same things that other racial groups have, or the opportunities to learn what new careers are, to get the educational opportunities, that's the root of it. It's not the wealth per se, but the lack of opportunity.
Yeah, I think I would agree completely with that. And I'll use the school systems as an example for that and how schools are funded. So if you really want to get mad sometime, look at the school funding model in Illinois. And so if you're in the north suburbs, let's just pick New Trier, and your kid goes to that high school, you're going to get paid X. Each student is valued at X. That's how much money is going to go towards their education. But let's say you live in Maywood, or let's say you live in you know, part of Chicago. It's going to be X minus. And so if I do the math equation a little bit differently, if Maywood is X, New Trier might be 5X, 6X, 7X. And so is it really equal? Now, again, there's a lot of reasons for it. Some are not necessarily racially motivated, but that's kind of like that FLEXNER report. Here's the side effect of that. Education is funded primarily by personal property taxes. Home values in Winnetka are worth more than they are in Maywood, so it's kicking off more money. In theory, that gives control of the local school system to the local community. That makes a whole lot of sense. But that disparity in income and personal property tax and how that funds each student, there's some disparities in that. And if you really want to get mad, look up redlining and look at what the housing industry did and what took the Fair Housing Act to correct. Look at what redlining did to income disparity amongst racial classes over the last 60 years, or go back 100 years. And so when you start to look at all those things, and Isabel Wilkerson does a masterful job, much better than I'm going to be able to do here. But you know, to answer the question, yeah, there is a wealth disparity, but it's going to come back to that root. And then what do we do to fix it? I think one of the things we can do is we can work on this educational system. That'd be one thing, one tangible thing that we can do. But guess what? Be prepared for a fight, because there's some people that are not going to want their dollars going to fund education for somebody else. So hopefully that answered the question.
Thank you so much, Wes.
Thank you.
How do we even explain what we heard yesterday about some South Side zip codes that aren't even getting their mail? I mean, I mean, that seems incomprehensible to me.
Yeah, that was in 1918, right?
No.
Yeah, and so that's the point. And I get asked this question all the time. Well, aren't we past racism? Does racism still exist? I mean, anybody can wake up one day and decide that, well, I'm mad at these people. I'm mad at those people. I don't like those people. There's some systemic stuff that we've got to call out when we see it. and not just say systemic racism doesn't exist, because it does. There's tentacles of it everywhere. And the more we ignore it, the more it has. Think of it like a cancer. You can ignore the cancer, but guess what? You're going to go from stage 1 to stage 4, and then it's not going to get any better. But if you address it when it's stage 0 or stage 1, you got a better chance of survival. But yeah, it's still going to be painful to get in there and cut that cancer out. But if you don't, oh my gosh, it's just going to get worse. And, you know, in fairness, I'm not a historian, but if you go back and look historically at what's happened in our country, go back to the Constitution, the copy of right here. We never addressed it here. Never addressed it. Wasn't addressed here. Mason versus Ferguson. Dred Scott decision. Examples of where this did not get addressed. So that's the hard work that it's going to take to do it. And yeah, one thing that Imar Kendi in his book Anti-Racist says that policies do play a big role in this, changing policy.
Other than non-discrimination policies from a formal standpoint, and then maybe vulnerability you mentioned, maybe sincerity, what are some of the other qualities you find in organizations that are successful, not-for-profits, restaurants that you want to attend, frequent, friendships that you want to have? What are some of the other maybe functional qualities and maybe just personal qualities that you find welcoming and successful?
Yeah, that's that again, it's a loaded question because I think it sometimes comes down to an individual. And so, you know, if I go in way back in 2020 when we could do this, like if I go into an office for a meeting and the receptionist greets me, and that receptionist is rude to me, well, I could tell myself a couple of things. Well, she doesn't like me because of the way I look. And then guess what? My mind can go to this place where that whole company is racist because of how this lowest paid person on the pay scale treated me. So a lot of times it comes down to, you know, what are that organization's values on paper? And then how does what they do match up with those values? And honestly, that's a big part of my business, is going into companies and doing assessments on their policies, reading the board minutes, and then talking to employees and seeing if they're really walking the talk. But you use the word welcoming, whether it's a restaurant, whether it's a business. Am I being treated just like the other person? Am I being treated fairly? Or am I being treated differently because of the way I look? So I'm laughing because I told you I used to walk my dog, still do, although it's pretty cold out now. But right after Mr. Floyd was murdered, you know, everybody in my neighborhood, they'd come out just to wave and say hi. And I think part of that was just trying to, hey, look, I like people look like you too. I mean, it was just kind of, it was sort of an overreaction. You know, I appreciate it, but I'm on one of these walks and a neighbor I don't know all that well was outside, and she came out and said, hey, Wes, yeah, how are you doing? What a great coaching question. Thank you for asking. Fantastic conversation. And I asked her, I said, how are you talking to your kids about this? How do you explain this to your kids who are 8 and 6? What are you telling them? And she just had a fantastic explanation of how she talked about people, and people are people, and you've got to get to know people, and you can't judge people by how they look. And I'm like, you are the best mom ever, seriously. And it was just a very powerful moment. But you know what? Had a conversation. She was vulnerable. She put herself out there. And so again, I think it's those things, you know, diversity, equity, inclusion takes hard work and focus. It takes courage. But you know what? It's good for business. It's good for life. It's good for everything. When we can put on that lens, and don't just do a once a year diverse, like, for example, we talked about is if we're not just going to do a one talk and then we're done for a year. No, this gets incorporated into just about everything that we're going to do. Think about ethics training or compliance training. You can do it once a year, but oh my gosh, it's a whole lot better if you look at everything through a compliance lens or everything through an ethical lens. And that's sort of the approach that I take with my clients.
And Dianne, you gave me your one-word answer about how you feel about this, which was something I tried it, is my one word is respect. Can you talk about that?
I think as an agency like the DuPage Foundation, we have to have respect for the people we serve. You have to have respect for the people you're talking to, because without respect, people are going to pick it up instantly. I know when I'm being quote unquote dissed. I can feel it. It's something in my core, and I don't suffer fools lightly. When I know I'm being disrespected, I can stop and not give you my time. But I think going forward, we're going to have to look at how we approach certain organizations, but always do it with respect for what they are and who they serve, because our name is on those grants. And we don't want to be associated with organizations that would belittle our name, cause us to have some bad press. But also, we want the dollars we give to enhance people's lives and make them feel included. Because quite honestly, this county is changing and we see it. At first, it was the graying of DuPage, because I moved my parents here so they could be cared for without me going back to the East Coast. There were some challenges in finding housing for them because of race. And I needed to just keep plodding along. There's got to be a place that's better than this. But when we treat people with respect and dignity, you get a different outcome than when you globally assign a definition to them.
Excellent.
Very well said. That was awesome.
Well, as Wes suggested, this is the beginning of a conversation. I can't thank you both enough for being part of this webinar this morning and for yourselves willing to be vulnerable. It really, I feel informed, I feel humbled, and from the questions that were asked and the number of people that joined, it's certainly of interest to all. So let's keep the conversation going. So thank you again on behalf of the foundation for leading us in this conversation this morning.
And I'd like to say to all the attendees, if you have ideas for the next steps, please let the DuPage Foundation know, because as all three of us have said, this should be an ongoing dialogue and conversation in a space of trust. We want to know what you want us to know. How are you faring? How are your clients faring? Because we act better when we know better. Okay.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye now.
Have a great weekend.
Thank you.